Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 6. My name is Josh Pelland. I'm here with the other host of the show, Zach Robinson. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Can you say that 8 days after the New Year?
I think so. I mean, the Buckeyes are still in the playoffs, so it's New Year for me.
What does that have to do with the New Year?
Hey, I'm still happy.
How much of
the holiday spirit is still in me because the Buckeyes are still playing. So
how much
I'm
of your mind space does the college football
too
play?
much,
Yeah.
way too much. I am not sleeping well because of Matthew Golden right now. That's my biggest concern. You've heard it here first, folks. If the Buckeyes do lose, I suspect Matthew Golden to have at least one touchdown, probably two.
Is that a receiver on Texas?
Yeah, receiver for Texas. Big play on fourth down when ASU went quite aggressive and Quinn Ewers didn't even blink. Post over the top, back in the end zone, beautiful ball.
Oh, on the 4th and 13.
Yeah. Didn't even blink. Sark just called that play, dialed it up, boom. I'm sweating. Ryan better not mess this one up.
Yeah, this podcast will definitely be out after the result of the Ohio State-Texas game.
Most important.
I'm with you. It's just way too exciting to not think about at least every hour of each day right now.
The biggest thing I'm not liking is that it's the very similar vibe right before the Michigan game. Everyone's on Team Ohio State now. Oh, this is going to be – they're going to keep rolling. Yeah. Texas is down. They played tight game against Arizona State, went to double overtime. Same exact feeling. I don't like the disrespect of the Longhorns right now.
When I have those thoughts, I do remind myself that I would rather be in that position than the other position. Like, I'd rather be favored in the game than not favored in the game, even though it is a little unnerving when, like, everyone is picking Ohio State plus the points.
Yep.
So it's a good position to be in if you're an Ohio State fan. But hey, that's why they play the games. That's why they play the games, and I'm very excited about it. My second favorite college team is in the other semifinal. So, yeah, which is not a good take in the Ohio State world, because I would, if Ohio State's not in it, then I'm rooting for Notre Dame. So I'm rooting for an Ohio State Notre Dame.
I like Marcus Raymond.
Yeah, he was a Buckeye.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So I hope that's the final, and I hope Ohio State blows them out by 50 in the final, and we can bring one home. Ohio State fans are very, very spoiled just because while there haven't been the national championships that I think the fan base wants and to some degree expects. Demands, yes, exactly. They've spent so much time just being relevant. Like, their floor, I feel like their floor has been the highest of any program, at least since I've been, like, I don't know, a teenager. So it's a good position to be in.
Yep, I agree. Not going to jinx it anymore. Go Bucks.
Go Bucks, and hopefully this ages well. So today, we're back at it with our first episode of the new year. So thank you for tuning in. We have a few topics that we're going to discuss today, and this is going to be in a Q&A format. So those that have been listening to the season up to this point know that we still have one more outcome to discuss.
What is that? Is that part? That's part 4?
It would be outcome 4 of 4. Yeah. I mean, we had the episodes with
yes,
Eric Helms
part
and
6.
Sam Buckner. So
nice.
I guess it would be part 6, where we will discuss the relationship between training volume and strength gains. There's a good amount to dive into, so we need to make sure we set aside probably an entire afternoon for that one, just in case that one takes a little bit longer, and that's not the kind of time we're dealing with here today. So today we're going to take a step back from that, do a Q&A here. These questions are quite old, but they were good. So we're going to be discussing artificial intelligence, because we're definitely AI experts, so we'll dive into that first. Then we're going to discuss kind of a 2024 wrapped, or our biggest learnings from 2024. We're going to discuss some considerations and tips for training while traveling or training on vacation. And then lastly, if we get to it, we'll discuss kind of training block bias and how much of your training from a high level should be spent in hypertrophy blocks if someone is interested in strength gains. So with that, first question is related to machine learning and artificial intelligence. So this question asker asked, machine learning and AI in data-driven strength training, question mark. So I interpret that as asking, to what degree can artificial intelligence or machine learning, which I'm probably not your guy to differentiate between the two, but, to what degree can those inform training practices? And what scenarios or what applications or data sets could be useful, if at all?
Man, there's so many different ways you could take this question. I mean, first and foremost, like you said, we are not the machine learning and AI experts, the people with boots on the ground creating large language models and ultimately dealing with those types of problems. I have a ton of respect for, and I think that's going to probably be one of the biggest, revolutionary aspects of our generation when we kind of look back in the history textbooks in the next 50, 100 years.
Oh, so now you're a history expert.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
right.
cool.
Look at this podcast creep, right? You start doing
Exactly.
a podcast, I start talking about, all kinds of different things. But anyway, to me, I'll kind of put this under the umbrella of just how can we utilize maybe a more data aware or data centric approach to improve practice overall. And so this is where you just kind of get into the various different ways we can get really big data sets, similar to like other fields, like medicine and things like that. If you just think about the way that systems are designed in medicine and things like that, they're all contingent upon very, very clear and concise ways to consolidate large amounts of information, large amounts of data. You think about the way, patient information is conscribed during a doctor's visit, things like that. There's just so many ways of which strength training is kind of behind a lot of those fields to just get massive amounts of information that you can start to make inferences from. So I think that's starting to change. I think people are starting to become more interested in how we could potentially evolve these questions and these abilities. And so that's where things like training apps and whether you'd have the ones that have been around for a while, like True Coach and Train Heroic, or some of the more modern ones like the RP Hypertrophy app has become really, really advanced. And I know a ton of people are using that. And ultimately, that just gives you access to more information. But I think, to me, the more interesting thing that I'm personally wondering where the innovation is going to come from is the development of what I would call just the outcome aspect of the problem. So to me, just from a very, very high level, these types of integrations require something to kind of drive them, and having clear outcomes for these applications or these large data sets to guide whatever we're asking the AI to ultimately inform. I think that's the hardest part. So this is a basic example, hypertrophy. Excuse me, I'm sorry. What are we asking that to ultimately inform our training based upon? Is it the progression of volume load on a couple exercises? Is it some sort of body scanning technology? Is it some sort of circumference and caliber kind of equation? Like, there's so many different ways you could approach that. And then ultimately taking this massive consortium of data or information from these applications and trying to derive training principles from that. That seems like an interesting idea to me, but ultimately it still comes down to, can we define really good outcomes, and then having a clear and systematic process to try to identify, whether it be training variables or whatever you're actually asking those technologies to help you with. It's just that there's so many different ways you could take it in terms of what you're trying to solve, that I think those are the couple things that come to my mind in terms of the big issues that currently need to be dealt with. But I don't know if you have any other kind of thoughts that go down there.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is if you were to use if you were to create a system, a quote unquote AI system that could improve your training prescriptions beyond alternatives. So whether that be like a template-based program, whether that be something that kind of uses, I guess what would probably be best described as like an expert system. So kind of rules that are baked into a programming system, such as our Infinity program system, or what a coach would prescribe to someone if they were to kind of start with an empty spreadsheet or an empty document and create a program. So if you were to theoretically have an AI system, you would want to make sure that it's better than those things, right? And you would kind of the first step is determining that it is better, when it's better, so that you can expedite the process of getting that better training for the user, right? And I think what you're pointing out is that in order to determine what is better, you need to quantify better, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's a lot harder than folks
100%.
realize, especially for hypertrophy, right? So if we've talked about this in recent episodes, and we'll probably continue this thread in forthcoming episodes, but like if you have training data from someone, how helpful is that for hypertrophy outcomes, right? Like there's a reason in the lab we don't just look at strength gains or volume load progression or a 10 rep max for hypertrophy, right? Now, maybe if you theoretically had enough data looking at the relationship between something like strength gains, when strength gains are informative of hypertrophy using ultrasound or MRI or some other sort of direct measurement of hypertrophy, then maybe at that point, you could get inferences from training data. But as it stands now, I think there is kind of two fundamental issues in my mind. The first is it's really hard to actually measure those outcomes. And secondly, there is a lack of subject matter expertise with a lot of things, or I should say a lack of subject matter knowledge. So a basic example is, to what degree do strength gains or volume load progression inform direct measurements of hypertrophy? Because you would have to imagine that some sort of AI model doesn't start completely from scratch. And I think that there are so many open questions in our field and so many limitations with our measurement tools, the durations we use, that at least in my mind, we are so far off from something like this actually being helpful that I think anything that does try to take this approach, at least from what I can envision from the tools available, is almost certainly going to be worse than those alternative options like a template, an expert system, or an actual coach. Then beyond that point, I think I start to think about what actually leads to the outcome of interest and how many of those things are even solvable by an AI model, right? Like, is human interaction...
The issue isn't people not knowing what to do. Like,
rephrase that.
Like, oh man, go ahead. I gotta clear my throat again.
My man Zach is struggling over here. The flu's been pretty bad this year, hasn't it?
Dude, I got wrecked.
Yeah.
Absolutely destroyed. But what I was gonna say is that I don't think it's like very similar to nutrition in the sense that there's clearly an obesity crisis, but if you really ask people who struggle with obesity, I don't think the issue is that they don't really know what to eat.
Yeah.
It's more so the execution of those things. And I think it's the same thing with training, is like, we can quibble over the details, of course, and there are obviously better ways to approach the problem than others, but like, particularly within people within our niche, that's not the issue.
Is the reason you haven't reached your powerlifting potential because you're not squatting 3 times a week and you're squatting twice a week? Like, is that actually the reason? Or is it because of some things that might not go into an AI system, such as the degree to which you look forward to your training that day and the downstream effects that it has, and what factors lead you to being excited about training for the day, and therefore encourage you to set your training, your day up around your training, not in the sense that it is the main event of the day, but it is at least an important event of the day that gets a lot of mental headspace, and you kind of, put it in the time of the day that is best for performance, and not trying to squeeze it in before the gym closes, 10 o'clock at night. Those are the practical things that I think is just, having coached since, I always have a hard time defining exactly when my start date was, but having coached since like 2018 or so, it's just like these are things that I think maybe early on I was like, man, someday coaches, they're not going to be needed, but I think I drift further and further away from that, even as AI gets better and better, and I use it more and more in my day-to-day life. And
those are the parts. Where I'm at. Those are the parts of it that I have thought less about, but I think have higher upside. Is if you are able to manufacture some of that human interaction aspect of things, and essentially could provide a coach to.
So if you were to take all my conversations from clients over the years,
exactly,
and basically create a model that's me that would give the answer that I would give.
Yeah, but it's.
Do you think that would have the same effect?
It's the interpersonal part of that I'm talking about. That has the upside, like AI generated avatars, those kind of things. Like it's just a whole different world on like what's theoretically possible in the very long term in terms of creating a coach that's willing to video call you at any time and can have that. You know what I mean? It's just like there is potential leverage on that if you can figure out the way to get that interpersonal contact behind the ChatGPT text response to meet that threshold, or the way that the beloved Josh Pate kind of talks about the freeze point. Once it reaches that negative 32 degrees, ultimately 32 degrees, not negative 32 degrees. Once it reaches that threshold of being sufficient, then people can ultimately have that buy-in in terms of like trusting it as a real person. Man, this is a very different direction I thought this was going to go. But the other thing I was going to say quickly too is that the other thing I have in the back of my mind when I think about this being applied, particularly in the context of training, is we're just so far behind the amount of data we've collected and the things and tools that we have relative to other fields that are just starting to make bedrock, like foundational, huge advancements with this kind of stuff. That I wonder if it's just going to take substantially longer too.
I tend to think these days programming is almost permissive to progress and not necessarily the thing that drives progress. Like obviously the training stimulus itself is necessary, but in a lot of ways it isn't sufficient once you get past a certain threshold. Yeah. So I think when a lot of people think of an AI model of some kind for training, you think of the X's and O's of training.
Yeah, the magic bullet of training.
The magic bullet of training. And I think that pales in comparison to a lot of the other things that are going to impact your progress. Like I care a lot more these days about what is our high level body weight plan. It's January of 2025. Okay, we're eyeing a competition in July of 2025. I care a lot more about making sure we're bought in, executing, and we have a solid plan regarding how we're going to make weight for that meet, how we're going to potentially do a slow massing phase to fill out a weight class and executing that well. Those are the things that I think drive progress a lot more than slight improvements in the X's and O's. And we might get into this a little bit in the next question when we talk about like biggest learnings from 2024. But these days, I think exercise selection and individualization of exercise selection is probably one of the most important X's and O's. And I still think that could be in the AI realm, but that's probably quite a bit harder to do compared to the X's and O's themselves, right? Like, ultimately, that's a long way of saying I think we are close enough in terms of RPE prescriptions, frequency prescriptions, volume prescriptions, periodization approaches, tapering practices. I think we are like well past even the 80-20 principle of that. I think the things that remain are a lot of the like less tangible things that I don't envision some sort of AI programming model doing even in the moderate term. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you for the most part on that.
So have you heard of Dr. Gupta? drgupta.ai?
No.
So we were talking about like the interpersonal aspect of like whether that leads to additional accountability for your training, whether that leads to excitement about training, knowing someone's in your corner and is going to be there to give you a little nudge when you need it, pick you up when you had a tough block or a tough session or a tough week, or someone to celebrate wins with you, right? Like, again, I would tend to think those things matter a lot more than very specific X's and O's. drgupta.ai, I've never visited the website until right now, but I heard of it at one point. I just remembered the name, and basically that's the idea of this website, to my understanding. I'd have no idea if it's any good, but the idea is like, okay, instead of going to the doctor if something hurts, you use drgupta.ai. So I'm going to type into it, I'm getting over the flu, like my co-host here. I'm on a podcast, and my voice is scratchy. I keep coughing, and it's annoying. What should I do?
Apologies to your listener.
Let's see. Oh, I only have 5 messages left. Oh, you can sign up for free to get more messages. I'm sorry to hear that you're experiencing a scratchy voice and coughing while recovering from the flu. It's common to have these symptoms as your body heals. To help soothe your throat and reduce coughing, you can try drinking warm liquids like tea with honey, staying hydrated, using a humidifier, and avoiding irritants like smoke. Resting your voice and avoiding excessive talking or yelling can help your vocal cords recover. If your symptoms persist or worsen, it's a good idea to consult with a healthcare professional for further evaluation and guidance. How long have you been experiencing these symptoms, and have you noticed any changes in your condition since they started? That seems like a pretty standard like chatbot response these days, which is helpful. Like there's maybe that would point out to someone that a warm fluid might be more helpful than a cold fluid, and that can be noticeably different. But that doesn't give me the dude, one of my biggest wins from 2024 is I found a dentist I love. Like, I love my dentist right now, and even if his knowledge was in a chatbot of some kind, I'm just having a hard time imagining it's the same sort of experience, even if I were to get the exact same answer. So
that's where I think the AI video stuff like that's what I'm talking about, is like that to me is like the untapped world that I have no idea. Like, I don't know if you've seen like AI make videos of like going through like a futuristic city and stuff like that, or even people and the way that it can craft those kind of things. Like, there's a little bit of an AI thing now that people can kind of pick up on, but I think 10 years that's probably going to be gone.
Yeah.
And so at some point you literally could have Josh Pelland avatar AI person that it's the same information, like you said.
At that point, a lot of professions are having to adapt.
Exactly. That's where I'm saying it's like that's the wild, wild west. I have no idea to the extent that those kind of things can be mimicked. But like I think about different areas where they've kind of started to do things like that, like video games like Madden and NBA 2K. Like now they have facial scanning of players that look really, really realistic. There's just so many like different pieces of that equation that have been solved in different locations that at some point those things will be consolidated into these like, assistants that are front facing. Like, hey, go ahead and sit down at the dentist's office and our AI assistant will check you in, answer any of your questions, literally be able to personally walk you through that process at any beck and call that you want, because there's not a limitation on the number of people anymore. Now we have 30 virtual assistants instead of Tina, who's working at the desk for,
Shout out Tina.
So it just, there's that concept to me is really, really interesting. And that's not where I think most people's head goes with the AI and the machine learning stuff. I think it goes, like you said, to the nuts and bolts of training, but maybe like we'll talk about here in a second. Like you said, I think we've far surpassed the 80-20 principle on understanding the training principles that are going to get people the vast majority of the results that they're going to get, and the things that are going to allow people to keep making progress, I think, are these quote-unquote soft skills that encourage adherence, encourage a progressive mindset, and encourage consistency over the long run to get people to continue to keep doing the things that are necessary, even though the returns are way less tangible. You need that part of the process to stack up those small wins and keep making progress over the long run.
No, to be clear, I do think there's obviously still a lot to learn in the training stimulus and training program design domain. So I don't want to make it seem like your program just has to be at least okay. But I guess to be more specific with where my head is at with this is that the margin of potential benefit from going from where you're probably at right now, if you have a coach or you have a good program that you've written for yourself, or you're using a solid expert system, to a theoretically perfect program, there's absolutely an improvement to be had there. But that probably that's probably much smaller than the marginal improvement going from less of these less tangible things, whether it's buy-in, excitement for training, optimism about training, belief that you can improve whatever outcome you're interested in. I think that is much larger. And in my experience, those are the things that folks really value in. I'm coming at this from a coach's perspective in a coach-client relationship, right? They might come and be excited for the first training cycle about the exact way you program and the exact X's and O's and your flavor, your style. But I think pretty quickly the value is in that, right? That's part of it, but the value increasingly becomes things that are not X's and O's. And I don't see. I think that's just a very difficult task for AI in its current state to kind of overtake, if you will, or even provide like a complete shift in the way that people receive and execute training. So that's where I'm at with it. And I'm sure plenty of people in the comments know a ton about these things, and they'll let us know about their definitions and what we missed here. But in all seriousness, we look forward to thoughts in the comments.
Yep.
Anything to add?
Not really. Yeah, I think we covered most of it.
Cool. I'll ask you this next one as well, because I think the first one we kind of chatted about beforehand is very much up your alley. So I'll let you take the baton on this one. This one is from Marcus. Marcus asks, what were your biggest learnings in the last few months? But it's early January. Let's just turn that into the biggest learnings in 2024.
Yeah, there's so many different directions we could take this one, and I'm going to struggle probably talking through this entire thing, so you might need to tap me out here a couple times. But I think the biggest one for me was just the topic of my PhD ultimately, and we'll do a proper full debrief podcast on this. I am currently in the stages of finally writing up the full version of my dissertation project for preprint and ultimately publication. But ultimately, I came into my PhD with a mindset of very much on the side of, hey, from my coaching experience, my own training experience, there do seem to be magic bullets in terms of the training prescription that's going to optimize things for people. And I very much
What do you mean by that?
I very much thought of that from kind of like the physiology aspect of things. So like whether that be your fiber type makeup, what do
you mean by magic bullets though? I think that's important to
there's
make sure it's clear.
Training prescription that is essentially the right fit for you. That is fundamentally different than the right fit for me and fundamentally different from the right fit from somebody else. And there aren't necessarily commonalities that can explain that outside of unique physiological factors that we may or may not be able to measure. So said another way, you could arrive at there are no principles that would allow you to arrive on that necessarily outside of that's what they respond well to. Or magic bullet sounds like a negative connotation. That's not what I mean, but it's more so there's just a unique combination of training variables that there is no clear systematic principle across individuals that would lead you to that conclusion.
It's a specific formula that is just that unique to the individual.
Yeah.
And your thinking with your project is, how can we get insight into explaining those things
and identifying them
and identifying them. So I guess
if possible, identifying them if possible.
So you're thinking with your main PhD project was, okay, I have this experience in coaching. This is kind of how I think about training in that.
And a misunderstanding of the data, but I thought I had very strong evidence for that as well.
So you kind of thought of it from an outcome-oriented perspective in the sense that, okay, I see that the best results seem to come from specific inputs in my coaching experience. So therefore, obviously something has to explain them, but I don't really know what explains them. So I want to, A, identify this unique individual response variation, and B, see if we can't find some explanatory, find a way to explain why this occurs in some people and not others. So basic example might be training status, right? So if you have protocol A versus protocol B, let's say I respond better to protocol A, you respond better to protocol B. Why is that the case? Maybe it's because you've been training for 50% longer than I have. Yeah. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think another easy example is like the actual question that we tried to answer in the study was high versus low volumes. And some hypotheses that people have had is like, is an individual that's able to perform considerably more repetitions than average on a repetitions to failure test at 70% of their 1RM. So if I can do 20 reps, am I a high volume guy? Or if I can do 5 reps, am I a low volume guy? Those kind of things. And so we tested a bunch of those. And that's essentially the general concept is, okay, is there, first and foremost, can we confirm that people genuinely, you're a high volume guy and I'm a low volume guy? Is that a correct assumption?
That's step one.
Yeah, it's step one.
If something is going to explain different outcomes, you need to confirm that they're actually different outcomes.
Exactly. And then the second step would be, okay, if that is the case, is there any diagnostic factors that are hopefully available to coaches that could identify the fact beforehand that you are a low volume guy?
Such as the reps to failure test.
Exactly. So that is how I came into my PhD, very much with the understanding that, like, hey, this is a foregone conclusion. I'm just let's
proving it.
Yeah, let's add some more color to this. And then that began the long, laborious road of understanding this at a much different level than I came into understanding, with an awesome committee that pushed me to just understand this in a completely different way and hopefully more accurately at this point. But long story short of it, and again, this is going to require a whole episode with visuals and things to kind of talk through it. But I just fundamentally don't think that the variability that we are able to quantify between training interventions for a given individual, so for me, high volume versus low volume, I don't think that variability seems to be so massive that it needs to be a fundamental training consideration. And at face value, people may be like, that's ridiculous. Like, I know somebody that has, anecdotes, personal experience, et cetera. And again, I have all those too, that my coaching experience doesn't go away, or at least the way that I viewed it. I think about it very differently now, but I think many of those anecdotes are probably driven by environmental factors, I think is a big one. Like, where were you at in your life when you try to give a training style? Those kind of things that you cannot separate from your ability as a human. This is why research is useful, to all the different biases that we fall prey to. I think that's part of it. But I think that also can have very real constraints on the training that you're able to benefit from. And that's where the most important part comes in, of interfacing these systematic principles that are pretty much the same in the sense that that's how physiology operates across individuals, that even within that can arrive at different practical solutions, but you're not playing by completely different rules. I think that's really what it comes down to, is that for the most part, at least to the degree that it's practically implementable and practically actionable on, I think the training principles operate essentially systematically across people. The thing that may arrive you at a slightly different conclusion, and maybe even a widely different conclusion in certain really extreme cases, is going to be predominantly the environmental factors and obviously the subjective preferences, things like that. What do you have buy-in for, et cetera, those kind of things. And the only thing that falls outside of that, I think, would be biomechanic associated things. And just a very basic example of why I think that is the case is just thinking about exercise selection in a research study. Even if you are controlling the exercise in theory based on somebody's segment lengths, you really aren't. So like just a squat, for example, like depending on the limb lengths of an individual, the muscular demands that are going to be associated with that movement could be extremely different. Mm-hmm. And that theoretically could have contributions to the way that the outcomes look because only certain things are measured in research, all these kind of things that I think biomechanics and like limb lengths and things like that and the influence that has on your training program that we're going to talk about here in a second is exercise selection. I think that's a separate class where I do think some individual like variability really could be a big deal. Just as a basic example, like a bench press for you may not be a good movement for pec hypertrophy due to the way that interfaces on your body. And ultimately doesn't allow the forces to be placed in the place that we want it to be. Stuff like that. So I think about this mostly from like the training variables perspective, but that's ultimately completely shifted the way that I've viewed training in the sense that I'm not searching for this magic formula or magic secret sauce of combination of training variables that I think is going to unleash a completely new wave of progress for an individual. I think fundamentally we're dealing with the basic training principles that physiology kind of aligns with. We try to identify those. We try to make tweaks into somebody's training program that matches their environmental constraints and also their preferences and things like that. That could lead to different practical solutions for individuals that looks from an outward-facing perspective that things are very different, but at the heart of it, it's not a completely different process that you're playing by different rules, again, is the phrase I come back to.
So go back to where you were when you were thinking about this question, basically operating with the experience of like, hey, it seems when I adjust someone's program and I get everything clicking, that's when things really take off. So like, you might the kind of the way that I see this in my mind, or the way that I think about this is like it's almost like a heat map of like, okay, when I had SSB squats in my secondary days, my squat just always goes up and I always hit a PR at the end of the block, right? Or whenever I do most of my volume work in the 3 to 5 rep range, man, things just really take off on my deadlift, for example. Or these sorts of like associations that you see, and I think going into your PhD, basically the thinking is, okay, those things are like real observations, if you will, right? So like that's my experience. Therefore, I want to try to explain that experience. Whereas now you're saying, hey, there are issues with even saying that the 3 to 5 training block, the volume work with sets of 3 to 5, like if you were to actually just repeat that, there's like, is that actually repeatable? And that's ultimately the data you collected and you know, kind of questions that experience before. So how do you think about those experiences before? Because they were still experiences of like, hey, people seem to respond differently to different things. There has to be an explanation for why that's the case. How do you think about it now?
Yeah, I think it really does. In the example of strength, I think it really does come down to, first and foremost, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I think that for the differences that we see between people, I think that's biomechanically driven. So the reason a training program may seem to work or not work, and those may be very different programs that you're looking at, it may not be even trying to address the same problem. I think that's the first point. So like just as a basic example, based on the way somebody squats, a different muscle group may be the quote unquote limiting factor. And so if a training program more strongly addresses that than another one, that's going to appear to be uniquely, it's the rep ranges, it's all these different things, when in reality it might just be addressing the actual biomechanical limiting factor.
But to me, that's like, I'm not saying I disagree. I tend to agree, but I guess how can you have confidence in that? You know what I mean?
I mean, I don't necessarily. I'm pretty.
You're just saying that's the most likely explanation.
That's a story that I can tell myself after having gone through this process and basically not trusting any of my experiences with any sort of true confidence anymore, because of the fact, like, if you really want to strip things all the way back and open yourself up to every single confounding factor of any of your observations as a coach, that's a very scary world. That is true. Second order effects, the environmental factors that you can't control. You can't test the counterfactual. There's so many different things as a coach that you're never going to be able to identify your experiences in an event where all of those are controlled in any sort of ethical format, where you're not putting somebody in an award where every single thing is controlled, right? And even then, you have time-bound second-order effects that you may or may not be able to control for either, unless you're doing some sort of unilateral training, which in it of itself has limitations. So point being, to get this conversation even off the ground, you need to be able to trust your observations, and I don't think you can. Like, that's step one, is that without some sort of systematic procedure, i.e. research, where we're trying to eliminate these confounders as much as possible, I think it becomes really, really challenging to identify signal from noise in any given applied scenario. So that's where you're starting from. And I genuinely have a very hard time trusting any of my intuition as a coach.
But
and so like that's where you start from. So I'm fully willing to bite that bullet and accept that. If we put that aside and say, all right, let me try my best. What is the identifiable factor? I think for strength, which is slightly different in the sense that I do think the biomechanics of the lift or the problem you're trying to solve, that's the foundational component, because that can be slightly different between people.
It seems almost like indisputable in a way.
Exactly. So like that's the part of it, but the reason that's relevant is because then all the other training variables, I think, can have multiple solutions that end up addressing that problem, and it's not necessarily one of those magic solutions that's going to push it. It's not the fives necessarily. It's that this combination of volume, intensity, frequency, et cetera, are solving that problem. That's systematic across people. And then the variables that are going to more likely address those problems are also principles of physiology that, on average, or even probably in most applied scenarios, if you can recover from it, more volume is going to lead to more muscle growth, all those kind of things that we tend to know. I don't think those are different between people necessarily. It's just that the applied solution that you reach based on the environmental constraints that you're operating within, your recovery, your sleep, your occupation, your mental stress and ability to cope with that, might be a different applied solution, but it's not like it's operating on some completely different playing ground. And again, this is a very, very esoteric conversation that's hard to even explain without visuals, so I'm not going to belabor this too much, but the point being, the practical part of it, I guess, is that fundamentally training prescriptions aren't going to look all that much different, because there are still these
all that much different from what?
From how I thought about it previously.
Yeah.
That part of it
doesn't... It's a similar process still?
To some degree. But it's, for me, the reason that you end on those different solutions for different people is...
Individualization. Like, you're not disputing individualization.
No, but the reason you're arriving on those solutions, for me, is almost entirely due to environmental and preference driven reasons, rather than, for this person, low volume is better.
What's an example of an environmental reason leading to a specific, a tangible individualization change?
Higher volumes are better for hypertrophy. Let's take that as the principle, right? But this person is a manual labor job. They sleep very poorly because they just had 2 newborns, and they are twins, and they're just a high stress person in general. For them, the exact number that equates to higher volumes is going to be different than somebody in the exact same, his twin. Let's take his twin, but he has an office job, no kids, and commits his entire life to training.
Gets his work done by noon.
Exactly. Yeah. If the manual labor guy was able to go and switch lives with that guy for a couple, let's say a year, I believe he would benefit from moving his training in the direction of what we believe to be effective. He's not a low volume guy. Mm-hmm. He just happens to not be able to manifest training prescriptions that would allow him to theoretically benefit the most, in my opinion. That's kind of how I think about it. And so the training that I would give him as a coach is probably going to be lower volume, lower frequency, lower time investment for a lot of those reasons. And that's going to look like, oh, this is a completely different kind of manifest in even exercise selection. I'm going to try to select time efficient exercise, machines, select electrolyzer machines if I can, like supersets, all this kind of stuff. Whereas this other guy, if he wants to train for 4 hours a day, because that's all he cares about, and he really wants to have things set up in a certain way, highly specific training, super high volumes, all those kind of things, it could look like you're operating on completely different principles to arrive at those solutions, but in reality, it's not.
Yeah.
It's driven by these other factors that I'm not necessarily searching for. Okay, what are the laws of physiology that this person operates on that's fundamentally different than this other person? And so that's really what it comes down to.
And that's obviously an extreme example, but you could think of a lot of like nitty gritty things that lead to these more specific adjustments.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, oh, man, every single time SSB is in my program, my competition squat goes up like crazy. What you're saying is there's probably a principle underlying that. Well, I guess the first question is like, all right, you got to probably view the fact that SSB was in there as permissive to progress as opposed to saying that just because we had 3 blocks with SSB in there and your squat went up, that doesn't mean there's something like elusive and can only be applied to an SSB squat. Now, maybe SSB squat, for whatever reason, is the only tool that can get the job done.
That's the part of it that I think, from a functional perspective, that I would change my mind on, is that coming into my PhD, I would very much view that like that exercise rep, proximity to failure, volume combination as like kind of sacrosanct, and I don't want to touch this because I might mess things up. I have no issues changing that now because I don't think it works like that. Yeah. I think there are...
I remember trying to be like overly specific when I would like try to say like, okay, this was the best block. We're going to run that.
We're going to run it exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And like literally like double checking. I didn't change anything, right?
Like I don't think it works like that really at all anymore. It's ultimately that is accomplishing something, and there's probably 10 different ways to accomplish that. And I think that part of it is why.
So that's why I said it was permissive, because it was a solution to fit within their constraints.
Yeah,
their constraints being not getting hurt.
Yep.
Their constraints being sufficient stimulus for what drives the outcome of interest, which is informed by principles we gain from research.
This is probably the most succinct way to put it. Coming into my PhD, I would have said there is a far smaller number of solutions that would allow you to progress at an optimal rate. Now, I think that is extremely wide. As you get more advanced, that becomes narrower and narrower because just the optionality that you have to kind of meet the fitness fatigue dynamics to make progress, I think decreases. But I still think even at that level, it's considerably wider because I think about it on a principles-based perspective.
So it's not a unique combination that I need to treat as like, this is the formula. It is, this combination worked.
Yes.
There are principles underlying why this combination worked, and there are probably multiple ways to accomplish that. And that's a lot. That's a much different way of looking at it, and it kind of seems obvious. I was
going to say it's so hard to even.
But I do think there is a very strong crowd of folks that, including us,
100%,
like
literally, not long ago before my PhD, like I was emphatic in that proclamation. Yeah. Like I was extremely emphatic in the sense that if somebody there's a very small band of programs that is going to allow somebody to progress at an optimal rate. And my job as a coach is to identify that small band of programs and ultimately keep searching for that and find that small band. Now, I fundamentally think about it completely differently in the sense that, coming back to my favorite analogy, the Price is Right analogy, if I'm trying to hit $1 on the nose or as close to it as possible, there's a lot of different ways I could arrange my coins to hit that dollar and theoretically progress at an optimal rate. Whereas where I used to think the problem was I need to hit $1, but I also need to use the exact same organization of coins to do so in the future to progress at an optimal rate. And I think fundamentally, I think that simplifies the training process so much because you're not petrified from changing something that is leading to success. Now, obviously, you want to know, okay, what things are maybe the largest contributors here, and that's where those big rocks and training principles help us a lot. But yeah, I do think it's really hard for people to like tangibly understand why that's such a big shift. But for me, that's absolutely fundamentally changed the way that I view training.
Yeah.
And as a coach, again, completely fundamentally changes things.
And it also just puts more stock in research, or I should rephrase that. It really heavily informs where resources should go. So if you adopt this perspective, resources should go to getting the best look at the principles we can, which we have a pretty good start on. And that's why we're fans of these like larger projects that look at the nature of the relationship of a given training variable and the outcome of interest, and trying to look at that the best we can, because those are the things that drive the principles that underlie this kind of principle-based approach, as opposed to this elusive, outcome-oriented approach.
Basic example for hypertrophy. Let's say we knew nothing. If I had somebody doing a slot and they're doing really well, their progressive overload is
an exercise.
An exercise is doing super well or whatever. Hack squat, 3 sets of 6 at 2 reps in reserve or whatever, and that's going super well. Research is going to allow us to identify which parts of that equation and their kind of relative weights on what, if I make a change, what's probably leading to the majority of the kind of the concept here. So like going from a hack squat to a pause hack squat, that sounds ridiculous, but like without a decent understanding of those principles, which obviously is in a large part due to experience, you don't know if that's a big change or not. But it isn't. Like, that's not a huge deal. It's like this essentially the exact same movement pattern. The resistance profile is going to be essentially the same, where the motion is the hardest, all those kind of things. And you're kind of able, in a very rough sense, to kind of do the mental math to say, okay, is this change something that's going to fundamentally alter the stimulus that I'm delivering for this exercise? And that's what those big principles give you. And so it allows you to say, okay, how wide is this range, and what places can I go in terms of the solutions that are probably going to deliver a similar result? If you don't know any sort of weights on each one of those variables, and it's almost impossible to do that. Like, if I go from 3 to 2 sets, is that going to blow things up? Probably not, but you'd probably want to keep that relatively the same, because that's probably the variable that seems to be the most related to progress out of all the major training variables that I kind of gave there. Things like that. Nice. But again,
a lot more to come.
A lot more to cover. Yep.
Cool. Okay. Other things that we learned in 2024, or maybe just like, I don't know, something weird about learned is not sitting right with me. Maybe just like our minds progressed on, or we thought more about, or we got more data about.
It's not the end of the story.
Yeah, it's not the end of the story. I think that's the issue with the word learn, is like it assumes that like now you know something. Yeah. There we go. Cool. I think an obvious one in terms of like where we got a lot of data was range of motion and its sister, if you will, exercise selection. We could definitely sit here and debate like the current status of length and bias training and whether that seems to benefit the outcome of interest. We can put a pin in that for now. I'm not all that interested in doing that, to be honest. But we got a lot of data on range of motion and exercise selection in general. So to me, in reflecting on 2024 in terms of like just my mental model of training and how that has changed, I think it's less so about saying like, oh, now, 80% of exercises are length and bias instead of 50%, right? Like that's not really how I think about it, but instead I view it as like, I think that's been a nice vehicle for me to just be a lot more targeted with exercise selection. I think in the past I would have been, and this was probably like many years ago, not necessarily like like the beginning of 2024, but a while ago I probably would have just thought like a hack squat and a leg press for any individual is like totally interchangeable. Whereas now I'm very curious about the exact hack squat and leg presses you have access to, how those look, the settings you're using, and giving you some feedback on how to execute them. Because I think that is probably some of the lowest hanging fruit for progress. So in this case, if we're trying to do one of those exercises for quad hypertrophy, again, I would have put way less stock in that in the past, but now I view that as like absolutely fundamental to pursuing the outcome of interest. And again, these things kind of seem obvious in hindsight, but I think like there's a time in the evidence-based community where proximity to failure doesn't seem to be like this very important variable. We've discussed why I think we were kind of led astray with that. And now it's more clear that, hey, this seems to be an important variable. Not to say you have to train to failure every single set or even 1 or 2 IR every single set, but it seems to be a variable to prioritize. So the way that I think about it now is like, okay, if you're trying to do an exercise for a given muscle, you're going to want the thing that's limiting you to be the muscle that you're trying to train. Again, seems pretty obvious now these days, but I do think that's almost been taken like even further in my mind. And I think that applies for hypertrophy outcomes for obvious reasons, but also in terms of trying to target quote unquote weak points, or like we like to call them strength limiters for powerlifters. I just care a lot more about very targeted exercise selection, the execution thereof. And I think the vehicle for that has been more conversation, more discussions, more thinking about exercise selection and range of motion and how to target the desired muscles, right? And, I think with our pre-printed meta-regressions on the effects of volume on hypertrophy, you might almost think the opposite of me, of what I'm saying. So you might assume that I'm just like, oh, it's just like, yeah, sure, leg press, hack squat, maybe one's a little bit better than the other for someone. But really what matters is the amount of sets that you do. I almost think the exact opposite. I kind of view it as like, okay, because we don't see this very strong plateau, again, there very well might be a plateau for numerous reasons. I kind of suspect that there is, and et cetera, et cetera. But there seems to be a pretty strong dose-response relationship, at least in like low to moderate volumes, okay? To me, I almost view that as less like a strong case for moderate to high volumes, but instead a strong case to make sure your training is as efficient as possible. Because one line of thinking is, if there is clearly a plateau in muscle growth that you're just going to reach, as long as you're doing sufficient volume, even if it's a non-optimal or a non-ideal exercise, then you're just going to get to that plateau anyway. You're going to get the growth you get. It doesn't really matter, right? You could do a high bar squat or a hack squat, even if you have long femurs like me and the high bar squat, you kind of look like Bambi doing it. Whereas now I would say, I want every single set you do to be as effective and as potent and as efficient as possible, because I have strong intuition that the more stimulus the muscle gets, the more it's going to grow. There's not going to be this clear plateau point. So I kind of want to make sure we get off the ground as efficiently as possible, and I want exercise selection to be very, very dialed in. And I use the example of like leg press or hack squat or high bar squat because I think quad training just happens to be the one that requires the most thinking. This probably has less of an effect on the average bicep protocols that I prescribe for a client. It impacts it to some degree, but it seems that lower body,
just multi-joint
stuff in general seems to impact a little bit more. So that's where I'm at in reflection of 2024 is I am still team low volume from a personal perspective. And I think with really good exercise selection, you can crush, you can make a lot of progress and kind of shortcut it, if you will.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like the way that we were just talking about it for me, and for better or worse reasons, I was definitely more so on the just not as sufficiently nuanced view on exercise selection and how you can modulate those things. And I think really what happened for me, I guess, this year is like just kind of understanding better how things fit together and like how to place things and swap exercises out based on like more nuanced factors. Like you said, like I don't want to say like it was like a completely brain dead way of thinking about it, but it really was kind of like leg press, hack squat, like whatever. That's not
there. There was a time in the exercise science community where it was like, dude, if you're performing knee flexion, like you're going to train your quads.
Squat pattern, boom, easy, done. Squat, hinge, leg extension, leg curl. That's all you need to think about it. And while I still think that that's going to cover most of your bases, and from like a simple recommendation standpoint, I think that's really, really effective. There are, again, coming from my perspective, where biomechanics is the one thing that I really think can be very different between people, particularly when you interface those people upon machines and fixed implements and things that have less flexibility. Like that's where you can get to some pretty goofy looking solutions that probably could use some tweaking, like you said, in the case of what leg press are you using, what hack squat, where's your foot placement, how does that look? Well, actually, in this machine, let's let your heels come up because that's going to it's going to better accomplish our goal of what we're trying to do here. They're just those kind of things. I think it's just a more nuanced view in coming into 2025 that I think now kind of, for me, at least I think, reaches that point of 80-20 of, you can get really, really nerdy of like the exact resistance profile and the exact muscle length. And like that's where we are kind of getting into the...
I think it is a little bit hard. Okay, so here's something I just thought of. So you can check me on this if I'm off base, but I think it's harder to get the 80-20. So it's harder to get the lion's share of benefits of really good exercise selection than it is to get the lion's share of benefits from volume. So like
100%.
Like I think it's a lot harder.
There's an experience component to exercise execution too.
It's a lot harder to mess up volume. Like most reasonable programs, if you find a program, even out of a magazine like a Bro Split, like I think could those be better? Sure, but I think it's probably going to be in a fine range, especially for a beginner or like an early intermediate. But I do think you can like not even get off the ground.
Yep.
That's a little bit extreme, but you can not even get off the ground from a muscle growth perspective if exercise selection is not in a good spot.
Yep.
And I think that's just become more of a focus for me. And like I look back at the years where I did a lot of low bar squatting, and I'm thinking in terms of years here. So if I had to guess, I probably for every 1 year of training with like a leg press and hack squat at my gym right now that I really, really like, I think for every 1 year of that is probably equal to about 3 to 4 years of quad growth from doing just a ton of low bar squats. So that's an example of like, I don't think I was really getting off the ground in terms of quad growth from doing a bunch of low bar squats. There's confounders there, but I think that principle holds true. And I think that's why exercise selection is quite high on the priority list these days for me. Tend to agree. Cool. Zach, I'm thinking we skip the rest of our learnings. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's going to turn into a aggressive monologue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on some of them recently. So
yeah.
All right, our biggest learnings from 2024, or our biggest progressions, if you will, is how to think about individual response and how to program accordingly. How to think about how inputs lead to outputs and modifications thereof. And then number 2 is a greater priority on exercise selection for both powerlifters and hypertrophy outcomes. All right, next from Cindy, training and vacation considerations, tips, and approaches. This one is not very research based, which is nice. We got to sit back and sip our whatever, our bourbon, and chat about training and vacation. Yep. You want me to kick this one off?
Go for it. Yep.
All right. So I think when I was thinking about this question a bit, I think about like if I were to have a new client and inevitably they're going to have some sort of schedule interruption. So let's say it's a vacation and I know it's coming up in a couple months. I usually I have good processes for asking about these things. So I kind of know when they're coming, and I'll kind of ask beforehand, like, hey, what do you want to do? And I actually don't think that's all that common. I think some people have like very strong opinions one way or the other of like, if you're on vacation, you shouldn't train. For some reason, if you're, spending money on flights and accommodations on your trip and you're also going to the gym, then you have some bad relationship with training that you need to do something about. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's like, dude, if you're not consistent with your training, you're not going to see any progress this year. And if you take 2 weeks off in the year, then everything's going to go to hell. So there are definitely cases where I'm going to lean one way or the other for certain people. For example, if I do suspect someone just kind of has to take a step back from training and maybe learn to go a week without training because I maybe there's something I suspect there in terms of their relationship with training, or maybe it's kind of on the other end of the spectrum of like, I think that could reignite the fire for training. I might recommend, hey, don't train. Or if someone's, in close proximity to a meet, or they have really, really ambitious goals, and that's something we've talked about, like, hey, we're looking to get everything we can out of training, then it's like, okay, let's probably keep training on vacation. But anyway, in the absence of those extremes, I just like to ask, like, hey, do you prefer to train on vacation, or do you prefer to not, or somewhere in between? And I think we can and should lean into that. For me, there are certain trips that I go on where I really want to train. It kind of depends who I'm with and where I'm going. And there are other trips where I don't want to train. I went to New England and did a road trip this last year, kind of all over the states there, the national parks, all that good stuff. I was very, very active. I didn't even want to think about where to go to the gym. I hadn't missed a week of training up to that point. I did not touch a weight, right? Whereas I had some trips to the Midwest in the wintertime. You don't get a whole lot of steps during that. You kind of feel like crap all the time. So I was very consistent with training during those periods because it just kind of fit into the trip a little bit better. So my first tip is lean into your preference and be mindful of kind of what you need to keep your mind sharp from a physical activity perspective based on what your trip is. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and I will now give my biggest contribution to this list in terms of, I think from like the nuts and bolts perspective of the training that you are doing, if you decide that that's the right thing for you, I think just having a clear priority system is probably the biggest thing. So if you're a powerlifter, understanding that certain exercises inherently come with a higher priority than others. That might be a little bit phase dependent if you're trying to in like a muscle growth kind of oriented phase. Maybe you're going to bias other things rather than others. But I would say in general, sticking to the squat, bench, deadlift and close variations thereof, and kind of consolidating that into a smaller number of training days. If you aren't able to get to the gym in your kind of normal schedule, that's kind of step A, and then you kind of fill in training with the other major muscle groups, probably predominantly focusing on multi-joint exercises to kind of hit everything. So for example, if you're short on time and you want to try to continue to train your back and your biceps to some degree, but you're also not trying to, have any superfluous exercises in there that are going to add up in terms of the time you're accumulating. Maybe you just pick the multi-joint back exercise. It's going to give you some sort of loaded elbow flexion. It's still going to kind of train your biceps.
But now, arm days and sandals, or with the hotel gym equipment,
and that's where you got to know your priority. And if you're a bodybuilder and you really want to just go to the hotel gym and just blast some bis and tris, you can also do that, and that's totally fine. And I think that's really what it comes down to is just you're going to probably condense things. Having a clear system of priorities is probably the easiest way to help you do that, and understanding that, again, a week or two of modifications is a very small drop in the bucket, particularly on longer time scales. And so, missing things in an optimal sense, I don't think it's a big deal.
I think ultimately what you're saying is just having some slots that are optional.
Yeah.
So basically just greater flexibility in training. So, okay, training this week, maybe just kind of plan ahead a little bit in terms of like, hey, I'm going to get 2 to 4 sessions in this week. So you're kind of making 2 your mandatory, and I'm going to get my first 3 slots in, or my first 3 exercises for when I do go to the gym. The rest are optional, because maybe things are pretty dynamic on that trip in terms of, getting to a gym, how much time you're going to have, et cetera. So basically just keeping things flexible. Obviously,
protocols too.
Yeah, in terms of protocols as well, right? Like maybe you don't have time to work up to a top set, and if you're particularly strong, or you take a while to warm up for one reason or another, this is probably pretty phase dependent in terms of what you're going to prioritize on that front as well in terms of the exact protocol. But I think we're both coming at this from a pretty like chill perspective, like kind of viewing 1 week of vacation as a drop in the bucket. Obviously, this changes with someone that travels once a month, right? Or to me, I'm thinking of vacation as like twice a year. That seems pretty standard from my experience. And in that case, you could even make an argument why taking both of those weeks off, completely off, could improve your progress throughout the calendar year. I'm not going to put my flag in the ground on that claim exactly, but at the very least, I don't think it's going to be a very tangible difference. Another thing that I do on this front, and again, I just like to really think ahead about these things. So kind of have those conversations ahead of time, make sure I'm clear on kind of like, just obviously the client's values in general, what the trip's going to look like, that sort of thing, so we can plan accordingly. The other thing I like to do is to work around it, right? So like another reason I feel like I can be pretty chill with this with a client is because I'm going to put like lower priority weeks on that vacation week. So if I know that, we have 10 weeks of training until a vacation, and that individual is not going to be, maybe they are still going to train, but things are it's just not going to be as much of a priority in the day. Things are going to kind of be out of whack. I'm probably going to do 2 5-week blocks and try to time it up so that we start a new block the week they're on vacation, because we're going to kind of intro into the block anyway. It's going to be a lower priority week, more of a recovery or deload oriented week. Cool. We can time that up with the vacation, and the vacation has a minimal impact on the training plan, as opposed to trying to say, hey, we're hitting your heaviest week of the block this week, and oh shoot, you're on vacation. Dang, we should have thought ahead about that. So just trying to time up deloads and intro weeks with vacations, I think, is a game changer as well.
Yeah, I think the moral of the story is just be prepared. I think is like to the best that you can, be prepared.
Even just thinking ahead. I don't even know if you need to prepare. It's just
I guess that's, to me, that's preparation. If you're thinking about it ahead of time, that's preparation. And that comes whether that's just like being generally aware of the gyms around in the space, so you kind of know what exercises you could or couldn't prioritize. And just going ahead with a little bit of preparation, planning ahead, trying to identify weeks that are a little lower priority, and then within each session knowing the exercises that are a higher priority. I think that all kind of wraps up nicely.
Have you ever been like on a trip where you're pretty far from civilization, you have to train in like a weird gym or no gym at all?
Oh yeah. I've done both the weird body weight table workouts.
Yeah. What exercises?
I mean, the classic.
Shout out James Steele.
Yeah, I was gonna say the infamous wall sit into bodyweight squats is always a welcome addition.
Is that still on YouTube?
Oh, I hope so. That is an absolute golden gem.
Might have to link that.
Yeah, we might have to link that. Shout out.
What Zach
Steele
is referring to is basically, if you don't have access to equipment, you have access to your body weight. You have access to basic things, presumably like a table or a wall. In those cases, you can find creative ways to take your muscles to fatigue with very little weight. And like something I've done in the past, just really slow tempo push-ups. Another way to do that, but those things are harder with lower body, right? So one approach that you can find, was this like a HIIT workout?
Yeah, I think it was like a walk through a HIIT workout with Dr. Steele, and he threw up I think he's wearing an Allen Iverson shirt in the video. And then, he's hitting a wall sit till the point where you can't hold yourself up. Yeah. And then you go right into bodyweight squats. So now the squats are challenging, and you're hitting failure within.
Because it's going to be very hard to get to failure with bodyweight squats. Yeah. So you kind of pre-fatigue with bodyweight. I've done that before.
Sick. The squats that I'm doing, I just hope there's never a camera in the place that I'm staying, because I'm sure they're absolutely atrocious with no load. Yeah, like it just feels weird to hit a bodyweight squat.
I actually, now that I think about it, so before I got my driver's license, so before I turned 16, we would always go on vacation to a pretty remote place every year. And before I could drive to the gym, that was like 40 minutes away, because I wasn't going to ask my parents or whatever to drive me that far. I would bring an easy curl bar and some plates, and we would throw it in the trunk. We'd drive it up there, and we would train in the garage every single morning. I remember I actually did 1.5 reps. So these days they would be called integrated partials. But I remember doing 1.5 reps on easy bar squats as a way to kind of expedite fatigue. And I was probably 14 or 15 years old. So how's that for being a little bit ahead of the length and partial curve?
That's sick.
And yeah, plenty of arm work to be done with that. And then eventually I did drive to that gym that was 40 minutes away. They did have a barbell, but it did not have like any center knurling. And the plates like barely fit on the bar. Or, I'm sorry, they fit just fine on the bar, but they were like super wobbly,
loose, yeah.
and the clips weren't any good.
Let's go.
So there was a lot of clanging going on there, but it got the job done. And honestly, some of my best memories of training
me too.
are on vacation.
Dude,
like when we've gone,
there's some no-name barbell gyms that like I don't even know like what kind of equipment this is. That I'm just like that's what I think of when I think of just like really good sessions.
Yeah,
like that's where I go to, not the super nice fancy gyms.
And here's another thing that I like to do that I guess we didn't put here ahead of time, is that I just like to have a ton of freedom on vacation. So like we mentioned, hey, if you're trying to stay on plan, know your exercise priority, that sort of thing.
Trying new machines.
Or just saying, hey, let's make it a total deload week, no training at all. But what I do a lot of times is, and I would encourage clients to do this as well, is just like, hey, take a free week. Do whatever you want. Just don't be a complete dummy and come back super, super fatigued.
Yeah.
But just go have some fun.
That's where I'll program, like, and call them a lot of different things, like a pivot with like a different kind of very simple organization, and then it just has like a bunch of exercise of choice. So like if there's a sick chest machine, you can go, you can go hit that. It's just way more flexible to like, if that's the vibe that you're going for on training. I'm like, hey, there's a cool bodybuilding gym here. I don't really care to stay on plan. I just want to go play around and
have some fun.
Kind of integrate that into the vacation as like part of the fun.
Check out other gyms.
I think that's kind of the way that I like to do it personally. I have a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah, I have really good memories of training while on vacation. So hopefully that was helpful. Do some looking ahead of time at gyms that are nearby. Try to plan them into your trip if that's your jam. All right, last one. This one is from Taylor. He or she asks, Taylor asks, should most training blocks be spent in hypertrophy blocks? So assuming this is for someone with powerlifting goals, can generally think of training blocks as more hypertrophy oriented, more strength oriented, maybe even like peaking oriented. Maybe you could have a category of like work capacity oriented. So should most of those be in hypertrophy blocks? Because hypertrophy seems pretty important for strength. So what's the deal, Zach?
I would think about this on, again, my favorite way of answering questions that's probably overly convoluted, is kind of like an if-then kind of situation. I think the reason I favor a block with like a focus or like a shift in bias, like a hypertrophy block or strength block, the reason I usually program things like that isn't because I think it's like a prerequisite for like optimal progress by any means. Like, do you have to periodize things in that way? I don't think so. I think it helps people stay kind of generally engaged a little bit more with a little bit more variation. It's like I said, it's like an environmental / enjoyment thing to keep people consistent, training hard, etc. That's like the main reason I do it. The other reason would be kind of fit within this if-then situation. If you feel that the quality of the kind of hypertrophy that you can accumulate within a training program is limited by some of the other strength work that you're doing, then I think that kind of introducing periodization makes sense. And the reason, a practical case where this is clear, beginners. I don't think a beginner needs like a super convoluted training program. Like you can kind of put the basic principles into like a week and then just run that week and keep making progress on that. The classic linear progression training programs for beginners. I think that makes sense. And then the more advanced you get, the idea is that, hey, if I'm going and hitting a single at 8 and then 3 triples at 85%, I'm going to be absolutely tanked for the hack squats to come or the leg press to come or the belt squat to come. So I'm going to make a compromise in the programming of my quote-unquote strength exercises to be something that fits in the family more so of the goals that I'm trying to accomplish in this training block. So the point that I'm trying to say is that I think the answer to this question is dependent on the individual, in the sense that how long you've been training, to the extent that periodization is necessary. But beyond a certain point, I would say most of your training probably should be spent in phases that are dedicated to progressing the strength limiter, and most of the time that'll be muscle growth dependent. In my coaching experience, research oriented answer on this, a lot tougher to say, if not
Can't
impossible.
Really say.
If not
It's
impossible.
really
So I think that does make sense for the most part, but like that's still one of the questions I do have kind of just in my brain that I ask all the time. This all comes back to the infamous initial low fatigue experiments. I was running my early days as a master's student in the muscle lab, training very early and kind of doing some of these early experiments on myself. I had a lot of success with concurrent programs that were kind of periodized but kind of not at the same time, in terms of like just running those consistently and not really periodizing things, but it had kind of all the flavors of sessions in kind of a multiple week time frame.
Okay, so break that down a little bit more. So you're saying that
Sure.
you played around with programming that kind of had all the bells and whistles,
all the qualities kind of at the same time.
Strength, hypertrophy, capacity.
Yeah.
Anything else that goes into there?
Not really. I mean, it basically
plenty of strength practice, plenty of volume for hypertrophy,
high velocity strength exposures, or like volume work for strength. That was like,
you mean low velocity?
No, high velocity, like low fatigue volume work. So
okay,
like
so low interset fatigue. So in other words, not doing heavy sets that are like bone crushing to RP 9 to 10.
Yeah.
Maybe keeping a few reps in the tank,
and then
to
also
minimize the velocity loss in a set.
Yes, and some of the idea that there are force outputs that you can reach with slightly lower moderate load training, like 60 to 70%, that you just can't achieve with even like the moderate load low interset fatigue training. So that's like a true benefit of quote unquote higher velocities. So like it literally covered every quality. Singles, singles to triples in the 90 to 80% range, and then high velocity reps is basically as low load as you can go without gravity being a limiting factor, also including some of that.
Like kind of West Side-esque.
Kind of,
Yeah.
yes, because like the idea would be like you can reach certain force outputs there because you can accelerate it so fast.
And to be clear for the listener, it's not necessarily something you use regularly now.
No, it's I just had a really, really positive anecdotal experience with it.
Yeah.
And the point, like you said, and then I also did some like true like hypertrophy work, take a couple sets to failure and a couple exercises, but then also I did some work capacity work where I'd set a clock for 15 to 20 minutes and I'd do rounds of certain body weight exercises.
Conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did all those and I made a ton of progress and I felt insane.
And okay, so you had all these different qualities, maximal strength,
Yep.
We could kind of say like peak power almost type exposures, failure or close to failure training hypertrophy work,
Yep.
and kind of conditioning capacity work. Were those all in a given session, all in a given week?
Yep.
So you didn't really think of it as like, oh, today's my strength day, today's my hypertrophy day. It
Not
was
really,
like more or less
there's a little bit of everything in every session. Yeah.
a little bit of everything in every
Hit
session.
a single, do some sets of 5 to 7 at 65%, hit a couple set of push-ups to failure, and then do my round of chin-ups and lunges or whatever it was, like some body weight stuff for time that's like kind of volume accumulation, but it wasn't also like
probably
true
wasn't
hypertrophy
like
work.
Truly to failure, probably just more limited by huffing and puffing.
Exactly.
So the way that I think about this is like that is ideal. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the programming that Zach just laid out is something that we would give the average person.
Yeah.
But instead, if we were to kind of take bread and butter programming, let's just say for the sake of simplicity here, strength-oriented sets and protocols and hypertrophy-oriented sets and protocols.
Yeah.
There's obviously some overlap there and some interplay. But if we were to just think of those as distinct entities, in a perfect world, those are all happening
at optimal rates all the time.
Yeah. And therefore, you just do as much as you need to optimize those or to maximize those. However, the only time you don't do that is when that's not practical, right? And that's basically where periodization comes in. I don't think there's some fancy schmancy phase potentiation. Yeah. I just think it provides a means to addressing what you need to address within the environmental constraints of the individual.
Do you think And this is always like the second tier conversation that I do have.
Can I finish the line of thinking here? Then we'll get to that.
Sorry, good.
Because at least in my mind, hopefully this is helpful to kind of tie a bow on what you were saying. So periodization leads you to kind of biasing one or multiple qualities at a time. But that's not to say that if you're doing a quote-unquote hypertrophy biased block, that there's no strength-oriented work. And if you're doing a strength-oriented block, there's no hypertrophy-oriented work.
That's bad periodization.
That's bad periodization. Exactly. So it's just a slight shift in emphasis, and the degree to which you shift that emphasis depends on the degree to which you need to shift the emphasis based on your inability to do it all at once. And then from there, I think the question that Taylor is getting at to kind of fully answer the question is like, okay, if I am going to have to bias some blocks to hypertrophy and some blocks to strength, how do I determine the ratio of hypertrophy to strength? And I would say in a lot of ways, man, I don't know if it matters a ton so long as it is good periodization and it is a slight shift in bias. I think this is a really good example of individualization that like I can't really explain to you through any given study or any given body of literature or meta-analysis, but instead it's just like, what do I think this individual needs to get over the hump in terms of like leveling up their total if they're a powerlifter. And for some people, that will mean a very strong bias towards hypertrophy blocks. For other people, that'll be a very strong emphasis towards more strength-oriented blocks. I really don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all. I think a decent starting point, if I were to think of like the average, is probably like a 60 to 70% ratio of like hypertrophy bias to strength bias. And then like, but like your mileage very much may vary, and you might not even need to periodize at all.
Here's a question. Let's say you get super elite powerlifter who's pretty jacked and already near the top of their weight class. Is that answer different?
So that's a really good example of like where periodization is like almost essential in my mind, because you can't do like heavy strength block after heavy strength block after heavy strength block.
I guess I came at that question from a different angle. Like to me, the question more so is the juice worth the squeeze of getting them away from the thing that is actually their sport when they've theoretically, almost capped all their muscle growth potential?
Yeah, so you're saying there might be skill adaptations or other things beyond hypertrophy.
What's the lowest hanging fruit at that point? I guess is essentially the question. Then does it shift from what we're saying most of the time? Because I think for 80 to 90% of lifters who, not to burst anybody's bubble, but probably won't train with the consistency and
long enough,
everything relevant to reach the point of hypertrophy not being a limiter, I guess is the point of view. Like I think that's going to be the case for the vast majority of individuals, novice.
Have you had anyone where you're like, man, I don't think they're going to see much more hypertrophy?
I mean,
and you program accordingly?
I would say there's been a few cases with bench where maybe that's the case, and I think that is again, back to telling stories, baby, like, and just convincing yourself you have a clear anecdote here.
Yeah, we'll lean on the data when it's convenient.
Yeah, exactly. I think it makes sense because people train bench from the time that they're 14 and sure, kind of train your upper body with more vigor than you do. Nobody's doing hack squats at 14 with the boys at the local Y or whatever, like with impeccable technique and like actually going to make decent progress on their legs. At least that's typically not my experience on what comes first with the degree of seriousness that you're going to train something. But everybody's trying to bench 225 at 18. You know what I mean? So there's been a few times on bench where I think you do get to the upper echelon of like, all right, like literally the only thing we can do is max out frequency, max out specificity, max out literally every theoretical variable that's going to produce positive strength results.
Yeah.
And you still do some high volume hypertrophy work and stuff, but you don't really expect that to make a huge dent, I guess.
I agree with your thinking there. The thing that I always come back to is like that is hard to repeat and it's hard to tolerate. So, like, kind of the reason you periodize in that case is
so you can do it.
So you can do it, right? So it's like
Yeah.
We can't do what we just did.
Yeah.
Because in order to get a 2.5 kilo PR, like we are at like 99% of your, we're redlining it, right? So it's like, okay, we can't do that. So let's just do something else that might help. And like
exactly, it's kind of wishful thinking in a way.
Yeah, and it's like okay, we got to do something right now. Obviously, we're not going to have you not train for the next 2 months. But hey, maybe there is some hypertrophy to gain. Maybe there is. Maybe if we do work you up to like 6 sets of 5 at 80% of your old 1 rep max, and like that's like a within session performance PR that you've never been able to do, and we take away top sets for a block, and then we reintroduce top sets, maybe things take off. And that has been my experience, especially on bench, when you kind of shift that bias quite a bit, things work out pretty well. But I think things just really change when you get to the point where it's like, I don't know what this individual needs. And I don't think we have the physiological understanding to make a good guess.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, it's like the principles are still the same, but the practical solutions become quite unique when training advancement is that high. But the good news is that 97% of lifters, this question isn't really relevant.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 things. The first thing is like there is the unfortunate reality that like it's not that you're reaching like a true genetic plateau by any means, but like progress becomes so slow that it's to some degree imperceivable. So like if you're the individual getting to 7 times a week bench with 9.5 RP singles, a little bit of volume work, like if you're doing all the bells and whistles, like truly
an extreme example, please don't start that program.
Yeah, like if you're that person who's like literally running Bulgarian on bench and is hitting 400 some pounds at 83 or whatever, you're starting to get to the point where it's like there may not be an answer, and like that's part of the equation. Now, obviously, us as training optimists want to always try to find the way that we can continue to keep that needle budging, but I think that is a reality of it. But the more important thing, like you said, I think it just comes down to, again, the number one training principle is being able to consistently train, and I think the more advanced you get, that is what, to me, periodization becomes more so about, is like the people that will get to that high of a level mentally, even have a level of I will crush myself, that having some sort of that variation built in there where the training goal is slightly different, I think just helps even from that reason of like keeping them healthy and not just hammering the exact same thing over and over again. And I think that's a big part of it too. But yeah, to answer the question, I think for the vast majority of people outside of like true beginners, I think, spending a majority of your time in blocks that are mostly biased towards hypertrophy, but it's not bad periodization where it's like completely devoid of anything else that mimics the things you're trying to actually progress in terms of, some sort of heavy load exposure or whatever, or like completely removing all specific exercise selection, things like that. Like, no, a slight shift in bias towards hypertrophy-oriented training, I think makes sense for the majority of people to do the majority of the time if strength is the goal, particularly if you're competing and you're only really worried about your absolute performance at specific points in time. That said, I think the more advanced you get, the problem that you're trying to solve gets more complicated and consequently has more complicated solutions that just have more nuance that you kind of need to take into account, and maybe is a little bit less straightforward. And then, as we said, I think you can still make a pretty strong case for more concurrent approaches that don't really view things as a shift in bias as much, and may have some theoretical upsides on that point of view as well. But anything to wrap it up?
No, I agree. We'll call it there. If you made it this far, if you could leave a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that'd be sweet. I think on Spotify we're over 100 ratings.
Let's go.
On Apple Podcasts, I haven't checked in a while, but last I checked, I think we were right below 100. So on your podcast player of choice, and maybe if you're feeling nice, you could go to both podcast players, leave a 5-star rating. I think it's either a 4.9 or a 5.0, so that means someone didn't rate 5 stars. Still love you, and I guess we won't see you again. But otherwise, we'll see everyone else in the next episode. If you're not already subscribed on YouTube, please go ahead and do so as well, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.